a man decided to remove an old painting in his grandmother's room, Dot. But what he discovered behind it changed everything. Subscribe to the channel and be sure to comment where you're watching this video from. The road leading to the old house was narrower than Michael remembered, a thin ribbon of cracked asphalt that wound between stretches of yellow grass and fields gone to seed. The late afternoon sun hung low, flattening the world in warm light that turned the dust into gold and the shadows into long, dark fingers stretching toward the horizon. The further he drove, the quieter it became. No hum of traffic, no distant sirens, only the steady rhythm of tires against the worn road and the faint rattle of tools in the back seat of his truck. He had not been here in more than 20 years, yet as soon as the first roof lines of the small southern town appeared, he felt the familiar tug in his chest, the uneasy blend of belonging and distance that came from returning to a place that had long ago stopped feeling like home. The house stood at the end of a gravel path, half hidden behind an overgrown magnolia tree. Its white paint had peeled to reveal gray planks beneath. The porch sagged slightly in the middle, and one of the shutters hung crooked, moving faintly with every breeze. The wooden railing, which once gleamed with fresh varnish, now bore the dull color of driftwood. The mailbox still carried the faded letters of his grandmother's name, Edith Monroe, painted by hand decades ago. He parked the truck, turned off the ignition, and sat still for a moment, listening to the ticking of the engine as it cooled. The air was thick with humidity and the smell of earth after rain. Somewhere nearby, a cicada droned. He stepped out, and the gravel shifted under his boots. The house watched him in silence, each window reflecting the setting sun like a half-lidded eye. For a moment, Michael thought about turning back, about booking a small room in town for the night, but the absurdity of the thought made him smile faintly. He had come here for a reason, to clean, to repair, to decide what to do with the place that was now his. A house full of the past could not frighten him. He climbed the porch steps, which gave under his weight with a long groan, and reached for the door handle. It was still the same brass handle with a small nick near the base, one he remembered tracing with his fingers as a child while waiting for his grandmother to unlock the door after church. Inside, the air was still and faintly sweet, touched with the scent of camphor, dry wood, and thyme. Light filtered through lace curtains, painting the hallway with thin patterns of shadow. The floorboards creaked beneath his steps as he entered, each sound echoing softly through the quiet house. The furniture was all where it had always been, the umbrella stand by the door, the faded rug, the grandfather clock whose pendulum had long stopped moving. In the corner stood the same framed photograph of his grandparents on their wedding day, their faces solemn and proud. He ran his fingers along the edge of the frame and felt a thin layer of dust coat his skin. He moved through the rooms slowly, not out of hesitation, but as if each step required permission from the house itself. In the kitchen, sunlight poured across the chipped countertop and an enamel sink stained with age. The old radio on the shelf above the stove was still there, its cord coiled neatly beside it. The wooden chairs were pushed under the table as though his grandmother might return at any moment to prepare supper. A cracked ceramic bowl still held a handful of dried beans. The simplicity of it all filled him with an ache he couldn't name. Nostalgia, maybe, or regret for the years he had allowed to slip by without visiting. In the small living room, the air felt heavier, as if layered with the residue of 1,000 conversations long finished. The walls bore photographs, sepia portraits, family gatherings, a young boy in a Sunday suit holding a fishing pole. His own face appeared in several of them, frozen in the innocence of another life. He paused before one photo taken on this very porch, his grandmother's arm around his shoulders, her expression both stern and gentle. The sunlight in the image seemed brighter than the light that filled the room now. When he reached the bedroom at the end of the hallway, he stopped in the doorway. This had been her room, the heart of the house. The curtains were drawn halfway, and a soft golden haze hung in the air. The bed was neatly made, the same patterned quilt stretched over it, corners tucked tight, as if she were still alive and expecting company. The smell of her perfume lingered faintly, a mix of lavender and powder. On the nightstand sat a glass of dried flowers beside a small lamp with a frayed shade. A folded pair of reading glasses rested atop a Bible. But what caught his eye, what immediately pulled all attention toward itself, was the painting above the bed. It dominated the wall, its frame carved from dark wood that had nearly blackened with age. The canvas depicted a woman in a pale dress seated before a dark background, her posture upright, her gaze fixed somewhere beyond the viewer. Her face was serene, almost distant, yet the eyes held something watchful, an alertness that made him uneasy. Cracks spidered across the surface of the paint, and the varnish had yellowed, but the expression remained alive, as if the woman behind the centuries-old brushstrokes refused to fade. Michael remembered the painting vaguely from childhood, though back then he had never dared look at it for long. His grandmother used to say it had been in the family for over a century, a portrait of her own grandmother painted when the country was still reeling from the wounds of the past. "She keeps watch," his grandmother had once said in a tone that allowed no questioning. As a boy, he had accepted that explanation without thought. Now, as an adult, standing alone in the dim room, it struck him as both odd and heavy with meaning. The woman's eyes seemed to follow him no matter where he stood. He approached the bed, noticing how the frame leaned slightly forward, as though the weight of years had pulled it from the wall. The wallpaper beneath it had darkened in a perfect rectangle, and faint outlines of where the sunlight had not reached framed the painting like a shadow. For a long time, he stood staring, studying the fine lines of the woman's hands folded in her lap, the way the brush captured the subtle sheen of fabric. It was beautiful in a way that time could not erase, yet oppressive too, as though the painting's presence pressed upon the room, commanding silence. He turned away and began to open the drawers of the dresser. Inside were neatly folded clothes, handkerchiefs with embroidered initials, a tin box filled with buttons, and a collection of old letters tied with string. The sight of them made him pause. He had come to fix, not to remember, but the house seemed unwilling to separate one from the other. Every object here was a fragment of history. He found himself tracing the stitching on the quilt, recognizing the pattern his grandmother's hands had repeated countless times. As evening settled, the air grew cooler. He opened a window to let the scent of magnolia drift in. The faint sound of frogs rose from the nearby pond, a chorus of unseen life beyond the property. He sat on the edge of the bed, looking once more at the portrait. In the fading light, the woman's face seemed softer, almost sad. Dust floated through the slanting sunbeams like slow-moving ash. He told himself that tomorrow he would begin properly, start the cleaning, assess the damage, call someone to look at the roof. He noted mentally that the bedroom wall needed repainting, and to do that, the painting would have to come down. Night fell quickly. The house, once filled with the faint noises of day, sank into a profound quiet. Michael stretched out on the couch in the living room, too tired to unpack the bedding. The ticking of the old clock had stopped years ago, but he could almost hear it in memory, marking time that no longer mattered. Through the thin walls he could feel the pulse of the place, the creaks as the wood cooled, the soft rustle of something shifting in the attic. Houses, he thought, had a way of breathing after dark. His mind drifted to the years he had spent away, the job in Atlanta, the long commutes, the distant city nights where no one knew his name. He had told himself he would come back someday, but there was always something more pressing: money, work, the slow gravity of distraction. Now, with his grandmother gone, the silence of her home seemed to accuse him gently. He closed his eyes, but even as he began to doze, an image of the portrait lingered. The woman's eyes, pale and watchful, seemed to hover in the darkness behind his eyelids. At some point in the night, he woke to a faint creak, followed by another. It was a familiar sound, the shifting of old timber, but it came from the direction of the bedroom. He lay still, listening, his breath held. The sound came again, a slight metallic scrape, then nothing. He told himself it was just the house adjusting to the cool air, yet sleep would not return. When morning finally arrived, gray and humid, he found himself sitting up on the couch with his shoes still on. He rubbed his face, feeling the dull ache behind his eyes, and laughed quietly at his own unease. It was only a house, only wood and stone and air and that portrait, just paint and canvas. He made coffee on the old gas stove, the flame sputtering weakly before catching. The first sip was bitter but grounding. Through the kitchen window he saw the magnolia tree swaying gently, scattering petals across the porch. A sense of calm returned. He took a notepad from his bag and began listing the things he needed to do: repair the front step, clear the gutters, remove debris from the attic, repaint the bedroom walls. Halfway down the page, without thinking, he wrote, "Take down the painting." Later that day, he returned to the bedroom with a hammer and a small ladder. The morning light illuminated the wall in slanted stripes. Standing before the portrait again, he studied it more closely. The eyes seemed less alive now, dulled by daylight, yet they still carried that peculiar sense of watching. He ran a hand over the edge of the frame and felt the roughness of the wood, the slight give where the nail had loosened. He thought of his grandmother, of the way she used to sit in this room each evening reading her Bible beneath that same gaze. Perhaps the portrait had been her way of holding on to the past, or maybe of forgiving it. He decided not to rush. The painting could wait another day. For now, he opened the windows wider, letting in the breeze, and the curtains fluttered gently against the light. Somewhere in the house, a door shifted slightly in its frame. The sound was small, harmless, yet it echoed through him. He turned once more to the portrait before leaving the room. The woman's eyes, caught in the morning sun, seemed to shimmer faintly, but when he blinked it was gone. He told himself again that tomorrow, when he began painting the walls, he would finally remove it. As he stepped back into the hallway, he had the distinct sensation that the house had been waiting for him all these years, not for comfort or company, but for reckoning. He could feel it in the weight of the air, in the hush of the rooms, in the way the boards remembered every footstep. The past was not gone here. It had simply been folded into the silence, waiting for someone to disturb it. And though he did not yet know it, that simple act of taking down the portrait would be the beginning of everything that followed. The second morning came heavy with moisture and the scent of rain-soaked soil. The air hung thick, dense enough to slow every motion. Michael stood on the porch with a mug of lukewarm coffee in hand, looking out at the trees that enclosed the property like a secret garden gone wild. The magnolia branches brushed against the porch rail, their leaves glossy with dew. Somewhere, deeper in the woods, a mockingbird repeated the same 3 notes over and over, as if trapped in its own echo. The house behind him seemed to breathe slowly, releasing faint groans from its joints as it warmed in the rising light. He had slept restlessly again, waking several times to the sounds of settling timber and distant dripping. The weight of silence inside the walls had begun to feel almost animate, not hostile but watchful, as if it had grown accustomed to being left alone and now observed his every step. After finishing his coffee, he began working through the list he had written the previous day. The first task was simple: remove the weeds that had swallowed half the gravel path and the narrow strip of soil along the porch. The ground was soft from last night's rain, and clumps of earth stuck to his gloves as he worked. Every time he straightened his back to stretch, he caught glimpses of the windows behind him. The reflections were faint in the morning glare, but the shapes within, tables, curtains, frames, looked like shadows frozen mid-memory. When he was a boy, he had thought the house had a kind of soul. Now, years later, that childhood intuition returned in a subtler form, not as superstition but as the unmistakable presence of time pressing against every surface. By noon, the sun had climbed high enough to burn away the mist. The air shimmered with heat, and sweat darkened the fabric of his shirt. He put down his tools and went inside. The kitchen, despite its stillness, felt cooler than the open yard. He filled a glass from the tap. The water ran cloudy at first, then cleared. The faint metallic taste reminded him of summers spent here long ago, of his grandmother insisting that real water tastes like the ground. He drank deeply, set the glass aside, and surveyed the room. Everything seemed preserved in amber. The clock above the door had stopped at 3:30, though he couldn't tell which day or year it had chosen to freeze in. On the windowsill sat a collection of jars filled with dried herbs, their labels written in his grandmother's looping script: thyme, mint, and one labeled simply for sleep. He spent the early afternoon cleaning. Dust rose in gentle clouds each time he shook out a curtain or lifted a book from its place. The rhythmic act of sweeping and wiping became almost meditative. He opened windows one by one, letting sunlight cut sharp lines across the worn floorboards. Beneath the rug near the hallway, he discovered an old coin the size of a button and a folded grocery list written in pencil. Both items seemed insignificant yet strangely charged, like small offerings from the past. He left them on the table, unwilling to throw them away. When he finally reached the back bedroom, the one that had belonged to his grandmother, the sense of stillness returned tenfold. The room held a different quality of air, cooler and denser, as though untouched by the breeze that flowed freely through the rest of the house. He set his tools on the dresser and looked around. The same bed, the same quilt, the same painting above it. The woman's face was barely visible in the dim light. A single fly buzzed near the window pane, tapping against the glass in a steady rhythm. He felt an irrational reluctance to touch anything here, as though his grandmother's presence still lingered, soft but insistent. Yet the logic of renovation prevailed. He moved slowly, folding the curtains aside and rolling up the rug, planning to paint the floor later. The portrait loomed above him, patient and unmoving. In the late afternoon, a neighbor appeared at the gate, a thin, elderly woman with silver hair tied into a knot, holding a basket of peaches. Her name, he recalled after a moment's hesitation, was Mrs. Carter. She had lived next door since before he was born. Michael thanked her for the fruit, and though her words came in a slow, measured rhythm, he could sense the curiosity behind her politeness. She mentioned how quiet things had been since his grandmother passed, and how folks in town were glad someone had finally come to tend to the place. She glanced towards the house while speaking, her eyes lingering for a second too long on the bedroom window. There was something careful in her tone, as though she weighed each sentence before letting it go. She told him she used to bring his grandmother fresh bread on Sundays, but in the final years Edith rarely came out. She spent most of her time in that back room, the woman said, then paused before adding, always with that picture above her bed. Talked to it sometimes, like it was a person. Michael smiled politely, unsure how to respond. When Mrs. Carter left, he stood at the porch railing, watching her small figure disappear down the road, her basket swinging lightly at her side. He felt the air around him settle again, thick with heat and the faint hum of insects. The mention of his grandmother talking to the portrait did not surprise him entirely. Old people often clung to rituals that made solitude bearable. Still, the idea that she had held conversations with a painted image lodged itself in his mind. That evening, after washing up, he returned to the bedroom. The sun had dipped low, and the room glowed with the amber of dusk. He stood near the bed, the sound of distant crickets filtering through the open window. The portrait seemed different now, its colors deeper, its shadows more pronounced. The woman's gaze had softened with the fading light, giving her face a depth that daylight had flattened. He leaned closer, tracing the edge of the frame with his eyes. The bottom corners were chipped, revealing lighter wood beneath. Dust clung thickly to the inner ledges where the varnish had cracked. As he tilted his head, he noticed a faint irregularity along the bottom edge of the frame, a line that caught the light differently. It looked almost as though the frame had been reinforced with a strip of metal. He stepped onto the stool and examined it more carefully. The thin, metallic edge ran flush against the wall, hidden beneath the wood's overhang. It seemed out of place, neither decorative nor structural. He pressed gently against the corner and felt a slight give. The nail holding that side had loosened over time. As he climbed down, a small cloud of plaster dust fell, leaving a faint smudge on the wallpaper below. He wiped it with his thumb, revealing a lighter patch underneath. Perhaps the frame had been mounted directly over an older repair. He made a note to remove the painting the next day when he began priming the walls. Before leaving the room, he looked once more at the woman's face. For a moment, he had the absurd impression that she was aware of his inspection, her expression tinged with quiet reproach. He shook his head at the thought. It was only shadow and fatigue. Yet, when he turned off the light, he could still feel that gaze lingering in the darkness, steady and unblinking. That night, he couldn't sleep. The storm that had been forming all afternoon finally broke after midnight. Rain lashed the roof, filling the gutters with the roar of water. Lightning illuminated the hallway for an instant, followed by the hollow crash of thunder that seemed to roll through the walls themselves. Lying awake on the couch, Michael stared at the ceiling, counting the seconds between flashes. Between the rumbling of thunder, he thought he heard another sound, a faint creaking, rhythmic, like something swaying against a nail. He told himself it was a wind tugging at the eaves. Still, he rose, lit the small lamp, and walked quietly toward the bedroom. The door stood slightly ajar. When he pushed it open, the first thing he saw was the pale glimmer of the painting's varnish catching the lightning. The frame swayed just enough for its movement to register before settling again. He stepped closer, heart pounding faster than reason allowed. The bottom nail had come loose entirely, and the frame hung tilted, one corner lifted from the wall. He reached out instinctively to steady it, his hand brushing the cold edge of metal along the back. The wood felt slick under his fingers, either from humidity or the sudden burst of rain that had seeped through the roof. He pressed the nail back into place with his thumb, then stood staring for a long time as the storm raged outside. When the thunder began to move away, he finally returned to the living room, but sleep once again refused to come. By dawn, the rain had stopped, leaving the air fresh and raw. Water dripped steadily from the porch roof, forming a puddle on the steps. Michael brewed another pot of coffee and stood at the window, watching the mist lift from the grass. His mind drifted back to the loosened frame, to the metallic strip he had felt behind it. Perhaps the painting had been repaired before. Old frames often hid reinforcement bars. Still, something about its placement bothered him. It hung too precisely centered on the wall, too deliberately fixed to cover that one portion of plaster. His grandmother had always been meticulous, but this felt more like intention than symmetry. Later, he spent several hours inspecting the attic and checking for leaks. Dust and cobwebs thickened the air. He found a stack of newspapers from the 1960s, a broken chair, a rusted trunk with nothing inside but moth-eaten fabric. Nothing significant, yet the act of exploration filled him with a faint restlessness, as though every space in the house guarded some small fragment of unfinished business. When he returned downstairs, the smell of damp plaster reached him before he even saw the bedroom door. He stepped inside and noticed a faint watermark spreading down from one corner of the ceiling. He cursed softly under his breath, realizing he would have to strip that section before repainting. The side of the painting above the bed, perfectly undisturbed despite the storm, felt almost mocking. By afternoon, he decided to begin cleaning the wall around it. He covered the bed with a plastic sheet and set a drop cloth on the floor. The first wipe of the sponge darkened the wallpaper with moisture, releasing a faint scent of old glue. As he worked, his eyes kept returning to the frame, to the fine crack that ran down the left edge. He imagined his grandmother standing here years ago, dusting it with the same care, perhaps humming to herself. He thought of Mrs. Carter's words about her talking to the portrait and felt an unexpected tenderness. Loneliness, after all, could make even silence seem like a companion. By the time the light began to fade, the room smelled faintly of lemon cleanser and fresh air. He stood back to admire his progress. The wall looked cleaner, brighter, though the area behind the portrait remained untouched. He wiped his hands on a rag, feeling an odd satisfaction despite his fatigue. The day's labor had anchored him in the present, but beneath that calm ran a persistent curiosity. What lay behind that painting? A patch of plaster? A forgotten inscription? Or simply empty space? He told himself he would find out soon enough. Tomorrow he would take the frame down properly, patch the wall, and finally put an end to his unease. That night, as the house settled into silence, he sat by the open window with the lamp turned low. The air outside was alive with the chirring of crickets, but within the walls everything was still. He could hear the faint ticking of cooling pipes, the whisper of leaves brushing against the siding. He closed his eyes, yet the image of the portrait lingered once more. The woman's face hovered in his thoughts, not threatening, not kind, simply there. It occurred to him then that the painting had hung in that room for more than a century, perhaps since before the house was even built in its current form. Generations had passed beneath its gaze, lives begun and ended, yet it remained, unchanged, unmoving, absorbing everything without a word. He set down his notebook and leaned back, listening to the quiet pulse of the house. Somewhere, deep within it, a small creak echoed, soft but distinct, as though one of the boards had shifted under the weight of memory. The sound faded quickly, swallowed by stillness. Michael exhaled slowly, telling himself that tomorrow would be another day of work, another step toward restoring the house to ordinary life. Yet, as he extinguished the lamp and the darkness folded around him, he could not help but think that the house did not want to be restored. It wanted to be understood. And the only way to do that, he knew now, was to uncover what lay hidden behind that portrait that had watched over everything in silence for more than 100 years. The morning light crept through the curtains in slow, fragile bands, filling the room with the pale hush that always follows a sleepless night. Michael sat on the edge of the couch, a mug of coffee cooling between his hands, staring through the open doorway toward the back of the house. From where he sat, he could see part of the hallway and, beyond it, the faint glimmer of the bedroom window. The air was still heavy from the previous day's rain, and the scent of damp plaster and old dust lingered faintly, mixed with the sharper aroma of coffee. It was time, he told himself. Time to finish what he had started, to take down the portrait and begin repainting the wall. It was, after all, just another task on his long list, no different from fixing the step or clearing the gutters. Yet the thought of touching that frame filled him with an odd resistance, a quiet reluctance that had no clear cause. He finished his coffee, washed the cup, and gathered his tools. A ladder, a screwdriver, a cloth, and a small pry bar he had found in the shed. The motions were methodical, almost ritualistic. He paused at the bedroom doorway before stepping inside, as though crossing some invisible threshold. The air there was cooler than in the rest of the house, dense and faintly metallic, like the air of a cellar. The morning sun had not yet reached this side, leaving the corners wrapped in shadow. The portrait hung where it always had, immovable, commanding. The woman's gaze caught the dim light, and the varnish reflected a faint ghost of his own shape standing in front of her. He set the ladder against the wall and climbed slowly, the wood creaking under his weight. Up close, the frame was heavier in appearance than he remembered, thick, carved, its edges layered with grime. The faint metallic strip he had noticed before gleamed dull beneath a coating of dust. He ran his fingers along it and felt the coolness of iron. It wasn't decorative, it was structural. Whoever had mounted this painting had gone to great lengths to anchor it firmly. He found 2 screws at the top corners, their heads nearly buried in paint. It took several minutes of careful twisting to free them. Each turn of the screwdriver released a faint groan from the wood, a small sound that carried strangely loud in the quiet room. When the final screw came loose, he felt the frame shift ever so slightly. He climbed down and steadied it from below, pressing one hand against the lower edge. The frame resisted, clinging to the wall as though fused to it. He reached for the pry bar, slid its flat edge gently behind one corner, and began to apply pressure. A brittle crack echoed, a piece of plaster breaking away, and the frame moved again, this time clearly. The smell of dry dust filled his nose, thick and old, the kind of smell that belongs to forgotten places. With a deep breath, he pulled harder, feeling the weight give all at once. The portrait came free from the wall, heavy in his arms. He nearly lost his balance on the ladder, but managed to step down carefully, lowering it onto the canvas cloth he had spread on the floor. For a moment, he stood over it, breathing hard. The woman's face now rested against the dim light from the window, and something about it seemed altered, the expression less composed, the eyes clouded by the new angle. Without the height of the wall and the dimness of the shadows, the illusion of presence was gone. She was only paint and pigment, the remnants of a long-dead hand's labor. Yet, even as he told himself this, a faint unease lingered, as though he had violated some unspoken pact. He turned his attention to the wall. Behind where the portrait had hung was a rectangle of darker wallpaper, untouched by sunlight for decades. But that was not what drew his gaze. At the center of that rectangle, perfectly outlined, was a patch of plaster that looked different from the rest, rougher, newer, and slightly raised, as though it had been applied hastily to seal something. He reached out and touched it. The surface was cool, dry, and faintly gritty. As his fingers brushed across it, a small fragment of plaster came loose and fell to the floor, revealing a glint of brick underneath. He stepped back, his pulse quickening. This section of wall had been repaired, but not like the others in the house. The pattern of brick beneath was uneven, irregular, and slightly recessed. He fetched the lantern he had brought from the truck and set it on the dresser, adjusting its light until it cast a steady glow across the wall. The texture stood out more clearly now. The mortar between the bricks was rough, inconsistent, as if laid by an unsteady hand. Whoever had done this had not cared about aesthetics. They had cared about concealment. Michael crouched down to examine the base of the wall and noticed faint tool marks near the floor, scratches left by something heavy being pushed against the plaster. A shiver ran through him, not of fear, but of recognition. His grandmother had never allowed anyone to move the bed far from this wall. Whenever he had helped her clean as a boy, she would insist that he dust around it, but never shift its position. He had assumed it was simply habit or caution. Now he wasn't so sure. He stood, took the small hammer from his toolbox, and tapped lightly against the bricks. The sound was solid at first, but near the center it changed, a hollow, faintly resonant note, the kind that speaks of empty space beyond. He tapped again, harder, tracing the area. The hollow patch formed a narrow vertical strip about 2 feet wide. His breath caught. There was something behind this wall. For a moment, reason tried to intervene. It could be a sealed vent, an old fireplace flue, some forgotten structural repair. Yet the idea that it might be more, something hidden intentionally, dug its hooks into his thoughts. He told himself that he needed to know, if only to understand why his grandmother had guarded this place so closely. He moved the bed away from the wall, covered the floor with the drop cloth, and set the lantern closer. The first strike of the hammer broke the outer layer of plaster with a dull crack. Dust rose instantly, filling his lungs and stinging his eyes. He coughed, swung again, and a small hole appeared, jagged and irregular. Through it, the faint gleam of brick showed more clearly. He worked methodically, breaking away pieces, his arms trembling from the effort. The room filled with the rhythm of impact and the gritty sound of falling debris. Each blow seemed to echo deeper than it should have, as though the space beyond absorbed the noise. The hollow grew larger until the shape of a single brick stood loose in the wall. He pried it free with the claw of the hammer and set it aside. Cold air rushed out through the gap, dry and stale, carrying with it the faintest trace of something metallic and ancient, like the smell of an old key left too long in a drawer. He leaned forward and held the lantern close. Through the narrow opening he saw darkness. No insulation, no filled cavity, just an empty void extending into shadow. Heart pounding, he reached through and felt smooth stone on the other side. The space was tight, but wide enough to suggest a passage rather than a pocket. He widened the hole brick by brick until he could see clearly. The gap revealed a short corridor lined with rough masonry and ending in what looked like a wooden door. He stepped back, sweat running down his neck despite the cool air. The door beyond looked ancient, its planks uneven, its hinges black with rust. It stood slightly ajar, but the darkness beyond was absolute. Every instinct in him screamed that this was not meant to be found, yet curiosity had already carried him too far to stop. He set the hammer down, took a deep breath, and squeezed through the narrow opening. The rough edges of the bricks scraped his shoulders as he passed. Inside, the air was close and dry, the silence so complete that his own breathing sounded loud. The lantern's light reached only a few feet ahead, illuminating motes of dust that hung motionless. The corridor smelled of stone and old paper. He took one cautious step, then another, the floor gritty beneath his shoes. When he reached the wooden door, he saw that it had been secured long ago by an iron latch, now corroded into flaking orange. He touched it, and the metal crumbled under his fingers. The latch fell away soundlessly. He pushed the door open, and the hinges protested with a shriek that echoed through the narrow space like a cry from another time. What lay beyond was not a basement or crawl space, but a small chamber, scarcely larger than a pantry. The walls were bare stone, and the ceiling low enough that he had to stoop slightly. Against one wall stood a wooden table, warped and bowed, covered with a thick film of dust. On it lay a scattering of papers, their edges curled and yellow. Shelves lined the opposite wall, filled with books, boxes, and glass jars that reflected the light faintly. Everything was coated in the same gray layer, untouched for what seemed like decades. The air felt heavier here, dense with the smell of age and disuse. He set the lantern on the table and brushed the dust from the nearest papers. Faded ink appeared, lines of neat handwriting, too faint to read without bringing them closer. He turned one over carefully, revealing a signature at the bottom. The name was unfamiliar. Beneath it, another sheet bore dates from more than 80 years ago. He leafed through several pages, realizing they were all written in the same hand. Steady but hurried, the pen pressing hard into the paper as if the writer had been racing against time. On the shelf above the table sat a small leather-bound book. The cover was cracked, and the initials embossed on it, E.M., caught his breath. Edith Monroe, his grandmother. But the handwriting on the loose papers was not hers. It was older, the style of another century. He turned to the first page of the book. Inside, in dark ink faded to brown, was a name he had never seen before. Eleanor Monroe, 1904. Beneath it, in smaller script, a single line, to remember what must not be forgotten. Michael's hand trembled slightly as he turned the pages. The entries were dated across decades, a mixture of daily notes and longer reflections. Some pages were filled with neat rows of numbers, others with fragments of sentences. The ink bled in places, blurred by moisture or tears. The more he read, the more the words seemed to weave a narrative of secrecy and burden, of decisions made in fear. He saw mentions of land transfers, of debts, of a man referred to only as the overseer. Then, in later entries, the tone darkened. Words like shame, protection, and silence repeated themselves. It was as if the author had written in code, revealing and concealing in equal measure. He looked around the room again, realizing that what he had found was not random clutter, but a deliberate archive. The shelves were filled with notebooks, each labeled with dates. Some bore water stains, others the faded imprint of fingerprints and dust. On the floor, near the far wall, stood a wooden chest with its lid ajar. Inside were stacks of letters tied together with brittle ribbon. He lifted one bundle carefully. The paper crackled in protest. The handwriting was the same as in the diary, elegant, deliberate, and unmistakably feminine. The first letter began, "To my son, should he ever seek the truth." He stopped reading. The words were too intimate, too raw. Whoever had written them had done so with the expectation that they might never be read, or that if they were, it would be long after the events had faded from memory. He placed the letters back into the chest and sat down at the table. The weight of discovery pressed against him, heavy as the air in the small room. It was not only history he had uncovered, it was the interior of a life carefully hidden. For a long time, he sat in silence, listening to the faint ringing in his ears that filled the space where no other sound existed. The lantern's light flickered slightly, casting his shadow across the wall, stretching it into the shape of another man. He felt both exhilarated and uneasy. His grandmother had guarded this room, perhaps never even entering it herself, yet ensuring that it remained sealed. Had she known what was inside? Had she been protecting the memory of someone, or protecting the family from what these papers contained? When he finally rose, dust clung to his clothes, and the taste of the air clung to his tongue, dry, metallic, unshakable. He closed the book, replaced it on the shelf, and took one last look around. Everything in the room seemed suspended in the same moment of time, untouched and unchanging, as though the act of discovery itself might disturb a delicate balance. He stepped back through the doorway, careful not to dislodge the stones around the opening, and emerged once more into the bedroom. The sunlight had shifted while he was inside, filling the room with a dim, amber glow. The portrait lay on the floor, its painted eyes catching the light, and for a fleeting second he thought the expression on the woman's face had changed, softer now, almost relieved. He brushed the dust from his sleeves and stood still, breathing in the fresher air of the bedroom. The hole in the wall yawned behind him, rough-edged and silent. It felt strange to look at it now, knowing what lay beyond. He did not yet understand what he had found or what it meant, but he knew one thing with certainty. This discovery was not just an accident of renovation. The house had wanted to be opened. His grandmother's silence, the portrait's weight, the strange tension that filled every room, all of it pointed toward this. He picked up the lantern again and turned down the wick, letting the flame dim until it was only a faint ember. The room darkened around him. He glanced once more at the portrait, then at the hole, and whispered softly into the stillness, as though to the woman on the wall or to the unseen hands that had built the secret chamber. "I found it," he said. His voice sounded small against the vast quiet. And somewhere, deep within the house, a faint creak answered, no louder than the sigh of settling wood, yet enough to remind him that silence, in a place like this, was never truly empty. The night after, Michael discovered the hidden chamber stretched endlessly, the hours sliding past in restless silence. Sleep eluded him. Every time he closed his eyes, his mind conjured the image of that narrow room behind the wall, the shelves lined with books, the fragile letters bound by ribbon, the dust that seemed to hold its own gravity. It was not fear that kept him awake, but an overwhelming curiosity sharpened by the weight of inheritance. He had uncovered something immense, something that pulsed quietly beneath the surface of his family's history, and it was as if the house itself refused to let him rest until he understood. By dawn, the first light had barely touched the treetops outside when he gave up trying to sleep and returned to the bedroom. The air still held the faint chill of early morning. The portrait remained on the floor, his painted gaze turned away from him as though disinterested in the work he was about to continue. The hole in the wall gaped open, framed by loose mortar and broken plaster. Dust coated the floor around it, a pale memory of last night's labor. Michael pulled the lantern closer, refueled it, and then, after hesitating only a moment, stepped once again into the narrow passageway. Inside, the air was as dry and stale as before, thick with the odor of old paper and aged wood. The stillness was absolute, so complete that even the faint crackle of the lantern's flame seemed intrusive. The sight of the hidden chamber no longer startled him. Instead, it felt almost familiar, as though it had been waiting for him to return. The objects lay untouched, exactly as he had left them. The open book on the table, the stacks of boxes, the fragile papers scattered like fallen leaves across the surface. He began with the diary he had found the previous night, the one bearing the name Eleanor Monroe. He brushed the dust from its cover and turned again to the first page, to remember what must not be forgotten. The words seemed less like a dedication now, and more like a command. As he read, the entries formed a mosaic of ordinary life at first, notes about household repairs, weather, the health of servants, and the upkeep of the property. But as he moved forward through the pages, the tone shifted. The handwriting grew tighter, faster, as if written by a trembling hand. The entries began to reference people and events that hinted at deeper unrest. Mr. W. came again tonight. I fear his visits bring nothing but shadows. Another line followed days later. He asked again about the documents. I told him they were gone. God forgive the lie. Michael paused, glancing around the room. The idea that this woman, his ancestor, had written these words while sitting in this very space gave the journal an almost electric presence. It was no longer just history. It was voice and breath made fragile by time. He turned another page and found entries written in the same hurried scrawl. Names appeared again and again, connected by fragments of sentences. Dawson met him at the river. The overseer was paid to look the other way. Eleanor knows too much. The words were cryptic, but their repetition suggested fear, perhaps even danger. He closed the diary gently and reached for one of the bundles of letters. The ribbon holding them was so brittle it crumbled at his touch. He unfolded the first letter carefully, holding it close to the lantern's light. The handwriting was delicate, each stroke precise despite the age of the ink. My dear Jonathan, it began, I do not know how to write what my heart trembles to confess. The days here stretch long and heavy, and though I'm surrounded by people, I've never felt more alone. Your last visit left me in turmoil, for I know what cannot be spoken aloud. If word were to reach your family, it would destroy us both. The letter continued for several pages, each line revealing more of a forbidden intimacy, a love constrained by the rigid hierarchies of the time. It spoke of late meetings, of promises whispered in darkness, and of the growing terror of discovery. The writer, Eleanor, described the world around her in language that mixed longing and suffocation. Every step I take in this house echoes louder than the last, as if the walls themselves wish to betray me. Even the servants avoid my gaze. They know something they dare not say. Michael sat back in the chair, the letter trembling slightly in his hands. The context was unmistakable. This was not simply correspondence between acquaintances. It was evidence of a relationship that had crossed the boundaries of class and perhaps even race, one that could have ruined entire families in that era. The more he read, the more he sensed the quiet desperation of a woman trapped between duty and emotion. He unfolded another letter, this one dated months later, and the tone was darker. "He has gone north," it read. "I begged him to take us with him, but he said it would only bring harm. The child is due before spring, and I do not know what will become of us. I fear for his safety, and for mine. There are those who would see us silenced forever." The last line struck him hardest. "If I do not write again, it is because silence is safer than truth." The words hung in the air like a whisper from the grave. He placed the letters back on the table, staring at them in the dim light. Each one seemed to pulse with the remnants of pain and secrecy. This, then, was the heart of the family's silence, the secret that had lain buried behind the wall, entombed in paper and dust. Eleanor Monroe had not been the serene matriarch immortalized in the portrait hanging above his grandmother's bed. She had been a woman marked by scandal, by danger, perhaps even by tragedy. He turned back to the shelves and found more journals, each dated by year. The earliest was from 1898, the latest from 1915. As he skimmed through them, a pattern began to emerge. There were mentions of land deeds, of money changing hands in secret, and of a network of influential men whose names carried weight even in the present day. It was not only a personal story, it was the documentation of corruption, a system of exploitation hidden beneath the veneer of gentility. The deeper he read, the more he realized that his family's silence had served as protection, not merely for themselves, but for others whose power remained intact through that silence. He came across an entry written in shaky handwriting, dated several years after the earlier letters. "They have begun to suspect," it read. "Mr. W. has warned me that certain papers must be destroyed, but I cannot bring myself to burn them. To erase them would be to erase myself. If these walls should outlast me, let them keep what I could not speak." Michael closed the journal, his pulse steady but heavy. It was clear now that Eleanor had hidden this chamber herself, perhaps with the help of someone she trusted. The sealed wall had not been an accident. It had been an act of preservation, a way of entrusting her truth to time. As the hours passed, the air in the chamber seemed to thicken. The lantern's light flickered faintly, casting long shadows across the stone walls. He had lost track of time, reading until the words blurred before his eyes. When he finally looked up, it was afternoon. The house above him remained silent, but in that silence he felt a weight pressing from every direction. He gathered several pages and placed them carefully inside his notebook, intending to study them later in better light. Then he stood and stretched, his muscles stiff from hours of sitting. Before leaving, he took one last look around the chamber. There were still dozens of letters and notebooks untouched, their spines leaning together like a congregation in prayer. The air was so still that even the dust motes seemed frozen. He imagined Eleanor here in the early years of the last century, her lamp burning low as she wrote by hand, recording secrets that could never be spoken aloud. He wondered what had driven her to such isolation: fear, guilt, or a stubborn belief that truth, no matter how painful, should survive. When he crawled back through the narrow passage into the bedroom, the change in air felt almost violent. The light pouring through the window was bright and alive, filled with movement. For a moment, he stood blinking, adjusting to the world outside that hidden tomb of memory. The portrait still lay propped against the wall, and for the first time since he had entered the house, he felt compelled to lift it. He leaned it carefully against the bed frame, wiping a thin layer of dust from the glass. The woman's eyes seemed softer now, their watchfulness tempered by melancholy. He wondered if Eleanor had sat for this painting after the events recorded in her journals, if the sorrow he saw in her expression was not simply artistic style, but lived experience. The rest of the day passed in fragments. Michael ate little, drank too much coffee, and read again through the notes he had taken. The names in the diaries echoed in his mind: landowners, merchants, men of influence whose descendants still controlled much of the county's wealth. The story forming in those pages was not only about love and betrayal. It was about power, about the way truth could be buried beneath generations of silence. His grandmother had inherited the house, but she had also inherited that silence, guarding it until the end of her life. Perhaps she had feared what might happen if the truth emerged. As dusk fell, he sat on the porch with the lantern beside him. The air smelled of wet grass and magnolia. The sky was streaked with orange fading to indigo. He thought of the countless nights his grandmother must have sat here too, her eyes turned toward the darkening fields, carrying knowledge too heavy to share. The idea filled him with an unexpected tenderness. For the first time, he did not see her secrecy as coldness, but as endurance, a quiet strength born of necessity. When he finally returned inside, he paused once more in the bedroom doorway. The hole in the wall was now shrouded in shadow, a black mouth against the pale plaster. The portrait leaned nearby, catching the faint glow of the lantern. The woman's painted eyes seemed to follow him again, not accusingly, but as though urging him onward. He whispered softly into the dimness, "I'll keep reading tomorrow." The words sounded strange in the stillness, yet they steadied him. That night, as he lay in bed, his mind drifted through the labyrinth of letters and confessions, piecing together fragments of the lives entwined within his family's history. He imagined Eleanor sealing that wall, perhaps with her own hands, determined to keep her truth hidden until someone in another century might uncover it. He thought of his grandmother sleeping beneath that same portrait, knowing what lay behind it and choosing to leave it undisturbed. The chain of silence stretched across generations, not out of cowardice but out of understanding. Some truths, when revealed too soon, could destroy rather than heal. But now the truth belonged to him. He had found it, and in doing so, had disturbed the careful peace that had guarded this place for more than 100 years. As sleep finally began to pull him under, he realized that the discovery had already changed him. The weight of the past had shifted onto his shoulders, and there would be no returning to ignorance. The letters, the diaries, the faces and faded photographs, all of them had opened a door that could never again be closed. And somewhere, deep in the darkness of the old house, he thought he heard a faint sigh, like the exhale of someone long at rest, whispering gratitude or warning. He could not tell which. Morning came slowly. A dim haze of light filtered through thick clouds, leaving the air damp and uncertain. Michael sat at the kitchen table with a mug of black coffee gone cold in his hands, the unread local newspaper lying limp and forgotten beside him. The silence in the house no longer felt like absence. It had begun to feel like presence, listening, waiting, quietly bearing down. The discovery of the secret chamber had unearthed more than just family history. It had shifted something within him, a gravity that pulled his thoughts constantly back to that narrow passage behind the wall. For days now, he had pored over the diaries and letters, trying to string together the fragmented truths buried in the ink of the past. But no matter how many pages he read, there remained a quiet ache of something still missing, something that refused to reveal itself fully. The story of Eleanor Monroe had unfolded like the slow peel of an old wound, raw, tragic, deeply human. The affair hinted at in her letters had taken place against the rigid backdrop of class and prejudice. Her writings danced carefully around names, but the implications were impossible to ignore. Her lover had not been accepted in her world. Her child, born of that forbidden union, had likely been hidden or denied. And somewhere in those spaces between the lines, Michael had begun to suspect that his grandmother Edith, the stoic, guarded woman he had known all his life, might have carried the burden of that secret, perhaps even embodied it. He pushed the coffee aside and stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the worn tile floor. He couldn't sit any longer. The stillness of the house had begun to press against his skin, like water rising slowly around his shoulders. He needed air, space, motion. Grabbing his jacket, he stepped outside onto the porch. The sky was low and gray, the wind carrying a sharp edge of autumn that stirred the trees with long, mournful sighs. Leaves skittered across the porch boards like nervous whispers, and for a moment he simply stood there, breathing. The family land stretched out before him, the tall grass now turning brittle at the tips, dotted with the golds and browns of the season's slow decay. Beyond the rise, past the stand of ancient oaks, lay the Monroe family cemetery, a plot of land he hadn't visited since his grandmother's funeral. A dull weight settled in his chest as he realized he had avoided it, perhaps instinctively, as though unwilling to face what might rest among those weathered stones. But something in him now insisted on it. If the truth was to be traced fully, it had to lead through the land itself, through the bones and soil, not just paper and ink. He made his way through the tall grass, the ground soft and damp beneath his boots. The oaks loomed ahead, their twisted limbs reaching out like old hands. The path to the cemetery was barely visible, overgrown with weeds and half lost to time, but his feet found it nonetheless. As he crested the rise, the first stones came into view, gray and crooked, their engravings worn by weather and years. The plot was small, no more than 30 graves arranged in uneven rows. He moved slowly among them, reading names that had once meant something to someone. Ruth, Charles, Timothy, Mary. He found his grandmother's stone near the back, a simple marker with her name, her dates, and nothing else. No epitaph, no verse, just the cold finality of her presence below. He stood there for a long time, unsure what he was expecting to feel. Guilt? Resolution? Instead, he felt the wind. It rose suddenly, carrying with it a scent of turned earth and wet stone, and then, behind him, he noticed a smaller marker set slightly apart from the rest, nestled beneath the branches of a crooked dogwood tree. It was older than the others, its edges chipped, the name nearly illegible. He knelt beside it, brushing away leaves and moss until he could make out the faint letters, Isaac, son of E. Monroe, 1905-1912. His breath caught in his throat. Isaac. A child. Gone before adolescence. And the initials, E. Monroe. There was only one person that could be. The grave was real. The child was real. Not just the subject of whispered letters or cautious entries in a journal. Michael sat back on his heels, stunned. The silence of the graveyard seemed to close in tighter, the trees holding their breath. He thought of the lines Eleanor had written about the child being due before spring, of her fear, of her desperation. And now, here, A stone confirmed that fear had become loss. The boy had lived, however briefly, and his resting place had been hidden in plain sight, a truth buried in the same soil that had nourished generations of their family. He returned to the house as the wind picked up, tugging at his jacket, whispering through the trees like voices just beyond hearing. The porch creaked under his weight, and he paused at the threshold, the old boards groaning beneath him. Inside, the air felt heavier than before. The walls seemed closer, the shadows deeper. He went straight to the bedroom, not even bothering to turn on the lights. The hole in the wall yawned silently. The portrait still leaned where he had left it, and now the painted face of Eleanor felt unbearably present. That night, as the storm rolled in and the house groaned against the wind, Michael returned to the chamber. The lantern's glow cast long flickers across the stone walls, and he felt the familiar sting of dust in his throat as he descended once more into the quiet archive of his family's ghosts. He opened more of the boxes, searching not just for facts now, but for understanding. The letters became increasingly sparse after Isaac's birth. Eleanor's tone grew brittle. She wrote less about love, more about survival. She mentioned visits from a lawyer, talks of selling off parcels of land, and warnings about keeping quiet for the boy's sake. But then the entry stopped altogether. The final one, dated early 1912, was only 2 lines. "He is sick. I fear this house has taken too much. If I vanish, let it not be in vain." Michael stared at the page, the ink smudged in one corner as though touched by a tear. The rest of the journal was blank. He leaned back, staring up at the low ceiling of the chamber. The truth wasn't just in what was written. It was in the silences, the gaps, the choices that led to them. Eleanor had lost everything. Her lover, her son, her voice. And somehow she had still found the will to preserve this room, this fragile record of her existence, as if daring the future to find her. When he emerged again from the chamber, the storm was in full force. Rain lashed the windows and wind rattled the old boards. But Michael felt clearer than he had in days. The pieces were falling into place, slowly but with undeniable weight. Isaac had been his great-uncle, Eleanor, his great-grandmother, and his grandmother Edith had likely known all of it, had grown up in the shadow of that legacy, inheriting not just the house, but the silence that came with it. He sat again by the fireplace, the lantern flickering beside him, and tried to imagine what it had been like for Edith. A child raised in a home shaped by grief and secrecy. A young woman bearing the shame of a story never told aloud. Perhaps that was why she had never married, never spoken of her own mother, never let anyone near the portrait or that wall. Perhaps she had lived her entire life not in fear, but in protection, guarding Eleanor's truth, waiting for someone who would finally be ready to understand. Michael felt a strange ache in his chest, part sorrow, part reverence. The house had given him this story piece by piece, not through spectacle or revelation, but through weight, silence, and presence. It had demanded patience, humility, and the willingness to listen. Outside, the wind howled. The branches clawed against the siding like memories refusing to stay buried. And deep in the house's heart, the chamber remained, waiting, quiet, unchanged. Tomorrow he would return to it again. There were still letters left to read, still pages yet untouched. But tonight, he simply sat in the presence of what he now knew. The past was no longer just something that had happened. It was something he carried, something he had inherited, not as a burden, but as a truth. one that would not vanish again. Michael had always believed that the past was something you moved through, acknowledged perhaps, but never truly returned to. Yet the days following his visit to the graveyard proved otherwise. The air in the house felt denser now, as though the walls had drawn in closer, pressing against him with every step. Eleanor's portrait remained where he had left it, but something in its gaze had changed. No longer a distant relic, it now watched him with the quiet knowledge of someone who had waited too long to be seen. The silence in the bedroom deepened, no longer a mere absence, but a kind of presence that required answers. The documents he uncovered grew fewer, yet each one seemed more potent than the last. Eleanor's final entries were cryptic and resigned, echoing an emotional fatigue that transcended words. Her silence after Isaac's death marked a turning point in the family line, a fracture that had sent invisible tremors down through generations. Michael had spent nights trying to piece together the implications. What had Edith known, and more importantly, what had she chosen to carry in secret? That question haunted him. His grandmother had always been dignified, firm, and private. She had never spoken much of her parents or of her own childhood. Her world had been defined by order, quiet rituals, and an unspoken reverence for the house and everything in it. Even as a boy, Michael had understood there were certain places he couldn't go, certain drawers he couldn't open, and certain questions he couldn't ask. Now he understood why. He sat by the kitchen window that afternoon, sipping from a chipped cup while the wind danced through the brittle autumn trees. Outside, the land had shifted into its late-season stillness. The grass had browned, the air grown sharper, and the long shadows of the oaks stretched across the fields like fingers of the past. He could feel the weight of it all pressing into him, not just the family secrets, but the responsibility of what to do with them. Later that day, a knock came at the door. It was soft, tentative, but enough to pull him from his thoughts. He opened it to find a man in his 70s standing on the porch, dressed in a gray coat and worn hat, holding a folded umbrella. His face bore the signs of a life spent under sun and strain: weathered skin, deep-set eyes, a jaw clenched too often in silence. He introduced himself as Harold Bennett, said he was once the caretaker of the Monroe estate lands and that he had known Edith when she was a girl. Michael invited him inside. They sat in the living room, the rain tapping gently on the windows, and Harold slowly unraveled a story Michael hadn't expected to hear. He spoke in measured tones, careful and deliberate. He said that his own father had worked the land under the Monroes back when it was still divided among white landlords and tenant families. Over time, the boundaries blurred. People moved on, married in, crossed lines that had once seemed fixed. Harold's father had known Eleanor, he said, had respected her. But after her son's death, things had changed. Rumors spread. The land was sold off in pieces, quietly, efficiently, and Edith was left to tend the house alone. Harold paused then, studied Michael's face before continuing. He said there were still people in town who remembered, even if they pretended not to. Some surnames still held weight here, not because of merit, but because of legacy. Because they had built their lives on silence and inheritance. He warned Michael, gently but unmistakably, that digging too deeply into old graves might stir things best left settled. Michael felt a quiet fury build in his chest. Not because Harold had threatened him, he hadn't, but because even now, after all these years, the same walls remained, the same boundaries, the same careful games of omission and suggestion. He thanked the man for his candor, saw him to the door, and stood on the porch long after he had gone, watching the rain fall in slanted sheets across the fields. That night, Michael couldn't sleep. He wandered the house like a restless echo, passing from room to room, touching old banisters, tracing the seams in the wallpaper, listening to the groans of the floorboards beneath his feet. In the bedroom, he stood before the portrait again, searching Eleanor's painted eyes for something more than resignation. He thought of Edith and the choice she must have made to keep the truth hidden, perhaps out of shame, perhaps out of protection, or maybe because no one had ever asked. By morning, he had made a decision. He would not let their story disappear into dust and shadows. He would not be the last link in a chain of silence. He gathered the letters and journals, carefully organizing them by date, and took them into town. The Historical Society accepted them with a mix of interest and reserve, their director promising to archive the materials properly. Michael made copies of everything, one set for himself, one he sent to an independent journalist in a nearby city who specialized in regional history and hidden genealogies. If the town wouldn't tell the story, someone else would. He knew there would be consequences. He had seen the way Harold's gaze had shifted when he spoke of those old names, the ones who still sat on school boards and ran local banks. But he also knew that truth, once unearthed, had a way of spreading. Quietly at first, like roots through soil, and then all at once. He wasn't interested in revenge. He wasn't interested in shaming anyone. He just wanted the past to breathe, to be known. As the days passed, he continued the repairs on the house, now with a renewed sense of purpose. The loose floorboards in the hallway, the cracked plaster near the fireplace, the rusted hinges on the pantry door. Each restoration felt like a form of respect, a gesture of reconciliation between memory and present. He painted the living room in a warm earth tone, sanded the porch rails smooth, and polished the brass doorknobs until they gleamed like old coins. The house responded in kind, shedding its weariness, its long-held breath. One afternoon, while sorting through boxes in the attic, he found a bundle of newspaper clippings tied with twine. Most were yellowed and brittle, dating back to the early 1900s. Among them was a notice from 1912, just weeks after Isaac's death. It mentioned the sale of land parcels from the Monroe estate, handled quietly through a local attorney. The buyers were unnamed, but one of the names on the deed matched that of the town's current mayor. Michael stared at the clipping for a long time, the lines of ink trembling faintly in his hands. The web was older than he'd imagined. He didn't act on it, not yet. Instead, he placed the clipping in a folder with the others, marked it, and tucked it away. There would be time later, if needed. For now, the house was enough. It was healing, as he was, and that process required space, time, and silence of a different kind. In the evenings, he often found himself sitting on the front steps, watching the sun lower over the fields. The wind rustled through the trees like a soft voice, familiar and steady. He thought of Eleanor, of Isaac, of Edith, of the lives shaped by fear and strength in equal measure. He didn't know what lay ahead, what stories might emerge, what resistance he might face, but he knew this much. The past was no longer buried. It had a name, a face, and a voice. And for the first time in over a century it had been heard. The portrait remained in the bedroom, but Michael no longer feared it. It was no longer a relic or a warning. It was a witness, a testament, a beginning. And the house, long silent, now carried not just echoes, but answers. The morning light came softly through the curtains, no longer diffused with the weight of unspoken memories, but golden and clean. For the first time in weeks, the air inside the house felt still in a different way, settled, not stifling. Michael sat at the dining room table, a small stack of folders in front of him, the last remnants of Eleanor's writings now carefully organized and labeled. The house had been returned to a quiet dignity, not unlike the woman whose image still rested against the wall upstairs, waiting for its place again above the fireplace where it had watched generations come and go. He had spent the last few days preparing the house not just for himself, but for the truth it now contained. The chamber behind the wall remained intact but no longer hidden. Its contents had been documented, preserved, copied, and, in part, entrusted to people who would ensure they would not vanish again. The local historical society had formally accepted the materials. The journalist he had reached out to had visited already, interviewing Michael in the living room while a portable recorder hummed quietly on the arm of the chair. She asked questions with respect and listened without interruption. She had left with boxes of scans and copies, promising nothing more than to do the story justice, and that, Michael felt, was enough. But even as he moved through these outward tasks, it was the inward reckoning that had occupied most of his thoughts. Each night he returned to the bedroom and sat across from the portrait, his eyes locking again and again with Eleanor's. And each night he tried to see her not just as an ancestor or a figure from history, but as a woman, a human being caught in time, in circumstance, in silence. He thought of the choices she had made, the pain she had endured, and the strength it must have taken to build a chamber in the wall rather than let her voice be erased entirely. There was a dignity in her that defied the limits of her time, a defiance that echoed even now in the bones of the house. The portrait had become more than a painting. It had become a witness. And Michael understood that restoring it to its place was not simply an act of decoration. It was a form of reconciliation, a gesture that closed the loop, that acknowledged her not just as someone who had lived and suffered, but someone who deserved to be seen. He brought the painting downstairs that afternoon. The frame had been cleaned and reinforced, the canvas lightly restored by a conservator who visited from the city. The woman in the painting, Eleanor, stood taller now. Her colors were no longer dimmed by dust and age. The look in her eyes was the same, but somehow more immediate, as though she had waited all this time to be recognized fully. Hanging it back above the fireplace took time. He adjusted the level, stood back, readjusted. The room was still. When it was done, he stepped away and let his eyes travel across the floorboards, the hearth, the polished edges of the furniture. Everything had been scrubbed clean, but the history remained embedded in the grain of the wood, in the faint creak of the joists, in the light that fell just so across the rug, familiar, like the house breathing again. In the following days, there was a slow ripple of reaction through town. A brief article appeared in the local paper, hinting at the documents Michael had uncovered, framing it as a remarkable discovery of genealogical interest. The names of the families involved were not mentioned. It was a soft opening, a careful toe into the water. But within a week, the whispers began. At the grocery store, Michael caught glances held just a little too long. At the hardware store, a woman he didn't know asked him quietly if he really was the one from that story. Some spoke in cautious tones. Others offered hushed praise. A few didn't speak at all, but their silence was different now, less indifferent, more watchful. Harold Bennett returned once more, unannounced. He stood on the porch with his hat in his hands, looking smaller than before. Michael invited him in without a word. They sat in the front room, no tea this time, no pretense. Harold cleared his throat and said that the story had started to make the rounds in other counties. A distant relative had called him, asking questions about land and inheritance. He looked tired but not angry, just resigned. Michael listened quietly. He had no apologies to offer, only the certainty that the truth mattered, not just for his family but for the town itself, for every name that had been forgotten, every face that had been brushed away. Harold said nothing more, only stood after a while and thanked him. At the door, he paused and turned back once. "I don't know what she'd think," he said softly, glancing toward the portrait, "but I reckon she'd be proud someone finally looked." After he left, Michael sat alone for a long time. He watched the shadows shift on the walls as the sun moved westward. He thought of the quiet army of ancestors behind him, people who had endured without fanfare, who had fought for dignity, not with weapons, but with silence and survival. He thought of Edith, tending this house for decades, guarding a truth that was too dangerous to speak aloud. She had not told him what was in the walls, but she had preserved it. She had left the trail. And now, in her own way, she too had been heard. The house was no longer just a house. It had become a vessel of memory, a monument not built of stone, but of breath and wood and paper. Every board he had nailed, every hinge he had oiled, every cobweb he had swept away had been part of a restoration not just of place, but of voice. The past had a home again. On the last night before he was due to return to the city for a short while, he walked through the house slowly, touching walls, corners, thresholds. He stood in each room and said nothing, only listened. In the bedroom, the portrait seemed to glow in the low light. He nodded to her once, a quiet acknowledgement. Then he closed the door behind him and stepped outside. The wind was gentle. The stars were beginning to appear. Across the fields, the tall grass swayed in the dusk. He stood on the porch and looked out over the land that had held so many secrets, so much pain, and yet now also a measure of peace. The house stood behind him, tall and whole again. And in that moment, he understood something deeper, that inheritance is not only what we receive, but what we choose to carry forward. He would come back. That much he knew. This was his home now, not just in blood, but in choice, in purpose. He would come back, and he would tell the story again, however many times it needed to be told, because the past, once seen, cannot be unseen. Once spoken, it cannot be silenced. And above the fireplace, Eleanor watched still, no longer a secret, no longer alone. Don't miss a single moment of the secrets we uncover next. Subscribe now and hit the notification bell so you're the first to see the shocking stories waiting for you. Check out the videos on your screen to discover even more unbelievable truths that have been hidden for decades. Share this video with your friends. They won't believe what really happened until they see it for themselves.